Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to take our time exploring something that might seem quite ordinary at first glance, but which held extraordinary importance in the medieval world. We're going to walk through the entire process of making bread, not quickly, not rushing through the steps, but slowly, methodically, just as it would have been done hundreds of years ago. There's something deeply calming about bread making, isn't there? The rhythm of kneading, the patient waiting for dough to rise, the warmth of the oven. These are timeless things, connected across centuries. And tonight, we'll immerse ourselves in that world, letting the gentle pace of medieval life wash over us. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin at the very beginning, not in the kitchen, but in the field, where our story truly starts. The fields of grain. Picture, if you will, medieval village in late summer. The sun is warm but not harsh, and there's a gentle breeze moving through the fields that surround the cluster of humble dwellings. These fields stretch out in long, narrow strips, the famous strip farming system of the medieval period. Each family has several of these strips, scattered throughout the communal fields, a system designed to ensure that everyone gets a fair share of both good and poor soil. The wheat has been growing since early spring. It was planted back in October or November of the previous year. Winter wheat, they called it, and it has weathered the cold months beneath the soil, lying dormant, waiting for the warmth to return. Now, in August, the wheat stands tall, golden, swaying in that breeze we imagine. The heads of grain are heavy, full, ready for harvest. This wheat and its close cousins, rye and barley, represents life itself to the medieval peasant. It is not merely food, it is survival. A failed harvest means hunger, perhaps even starvation. A good harvest means another year of life. So the approach to these fields, to this grain, carries with it a weight of reverence and necessity that we might struggle to fully appreciate today. But let's not think too much about the anxiety of survival just now. Instead, let's focus on the work itself, on the steady, repetitive motions that have been performed by countless hands across countless generations. The harvest begins early in the morning, when the dew still clings to the stalks. The villagers move into the fields together, men, women, older children, each taking their place in the line. They carry sickles, curved blades with wooden handles, worn smooth by years of use. These tools are precious, cared for, sharpened regularly on whetstones. The motion of harvesting is simple but demanding. Bend down, grasp a handful of wheat stalks in your left hand, sweep the sickle through with your right, gather the cut stalks, lay them down. Bend, grasp, sweep, gather, lay down. Again, and again, and again. There's a rhythm to it, you see, a meditative quality. The same motion, repeated thousands of times over the course of a day. Your back begins to ache, certainly. Your hands grow sore. But there's something almost soothing in the repetition, in the simplicity of the task. No decisions to make, no complications to navigate. Just you, the grain, and the ancient motion of the harvest. The villagers often sing as they work, simple songs, work songs, with rhythms that match the movement of their bodies. These songs serve multiple purposes. They keep spirits up, they help maintain the pace of work, and they bind the community together in shared effort. The melodies are old, passed down from parent to child, and they'll be passed down again. In this way, even the harvest becomes a thread connecting the past to the present to the future. As the morning progresses and the sun climbs higher, the cut wheat is gathered into sheaves, bundles tied together with bands of twisted straw. These sheaves are then stood upright in groups of 8 or 10, leaning against each other to form small structures called stooks. The stooks allow air to circulate around the grain, helping it to dry properly. They'll stand in the field for a week or two, these little pyramids of wheat, slowly curing in the late summer sun. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the sight. Field after field of golden wheat, punctuated by these stooks, standing like small sentinels. The sky above is that particular blue you only seem to get in late summer, and the air is filled with the scent of dried grass and grain. There's a particular quality to this smell, slightly sweet, dusty, warm. It's the smell of abundance, of completion, of a cycle reaching its fulfillment. Birds circle overhead, crows and sparrows, always ready to steal what they can. But the harvest moves quickly enough that they get little chance. This grain is too precious, too hard-won, to be left for the birds. After the stalks have dried sufficiently, the wheat is gathered up and transported to the village. This is usually done on carts if the wealthier farmers have them, or simply carried in large bundles if they don't. Everything is brought to the threshing floor, a large, flat, hard-packed area, often located in or near a barn. Threshing and winnowing. Now, we come to the threshing, a task that requires patience and repetition. The sheaves are untied and spread out on the threshing floor. The actual work of threshing, separating the grain from the stalks and chaff, can be done in several ways. The most common method involves the flail. This is a simple but effective tool. 2 wooden sticks connected by a leather thong. The longer stick serves as the handle, and the shorter stick swings freely at the end. The thresher raises the flail overhead and brings it down hard on the wheat, the free swinging stick striking the grain and knocking loose the individual kernels. It's rhythmic work, rather like the harvesting. Raise, strike, raise, strike. The sound echoes in the barn, a steady, hollow thudding. Multiple threshers often work together, their flails rising and falling in sequence, creating a kind of percussion, a drumbeat of agricultural labor. This is dusty work. The chaff, the dry, scaly protective casings around the grain, breaks apart and fills the air with a fine, golden dust that catches in your throat and makes your eyes water. The threshers often tie cloths around their faces to help with the breathing, though it never completely keeps the dust out. But there's something almost hypnotic about it, about the steady rhythm, the repetitive motion. Time seems to slow down. Hours pass, marked only by the movement of sunlight across the floor, by the growing pile of threshed wheat, by the gradual clearing of the threshing floor as each area is completed and moved aside. When the threshing is done, the grain and chaff lie mixed together on the floor. Now comes the winnowing process of separation that relies on nothing more complicated than wind and gravity. The threshed wheat is scooped up in broad, shallow baskets or wooden shovels. The winnower tosses the mixture into the air, and the wind, natural or created by the movement of the basket, carries away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain falls back down. Toss, drift, fall, toss, drift, fall. This is often done in the doorway of the barn or outside on a windy day, where the breeze can be relied upon to aid in the process. It's rather beautiful to watch, really. The grain and chaff rise up in a cloud of gold, then separate in mid-air, the chaff drifting away like dandelion fluff while the grain drops back into the basket with a satisfying rattle. The winnowing might need to be repeated several times to get the grain truly clean. Each time, more chaff is blown away, and the grain becomes purer, cleaner, ready for the next stage of its journey. The clean grain is then stored in large sacks or in wooden chests in a dry place, protected from moisture and vermin. Mice and rats are constant threats to stored grain, so cats are valued members of medieval households, and various traps and preventative measures are employed. The grain needs to last until the next harvest, a full year, so its preservation is of paramount importance. But we're not making bread from stored grain today. Let's imagine instead that we're working with freshly harvested, freshly cleaned grain, and we're ready to move to the next stage, the milling. The mill in our medieval village, as in most villages of the period, there is a mill. It might be a water mill, powered by a stream or river, or a windmill, its great sails turning in the breeze. These mills are usually owned by the lord of the manor, and the peasants are required to have their grain ground there, paying a portion of the flour as a fee for the service. Let's visit a watermill today. Can you hear it? Even before you see it, you hear the mill, the steady, rushing sound of water flowing over the wheel, the deep rumbling of the millstone grinding grain, the creaking of wooden gears and mechanisms. The mill sits beside a stream, and a channel has been dug to divert some of the water onto a large wooden wheel. As the water pours down onto the wheel, its weight and force cause the wheel to turn. This rotation is transferred through a series of gears to the millstone inside the building, a large, circular stone that rotates atop another fixed stone. The building itself is a sturdy structure, usually made of stone or thick timber. Inside, it's dark, cool, and incredibly dusty. The air is thick with flour dust that catches in the beams of light coming through the small windows. Everything is covered in a fine white powder. The miller is a skilled craftsman, an important member of the community. He understands the complex mechanics of his mill, knows how to adjust the stones for different types of grain, can judge by sound and feel when everything is working properly. His hands and clothes and even his hair are perpetually dusted with flour. He's become part of the mill, in a way, as much a fixture as the great wheel outside. Villagers arrive with their sacks of grain. There's usually a queue, especially during the busy period right after harvest. People wait their turn, talking quietly amongst themselves, watching the hypnotic rotation of the millstone through the open door. When your turn comes, you carry your sack to the hopper, a large funnel above the millstone. The grain is poured in, and it trickles down steadily between the stones. The top stone, the runner stone, ate steadily over the fixed bed stone below. The grain is caught between them and crushed into flour. The process is continuous and mesmerizing. Grain flows in from above, is ground between the stones, and emerges at the edges as flour, where it falls onto the floor or into collection areas. The sound is deep and continuous, a rumbling that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. The miller monitors everything carefully. The stones must not touch too firmly, or they'll create too much heat and could even produce sparks that might ignite the flour dust, a genuine danger in mills. But they must not be too far apart, either, or the grain won't be ground properly. The gap must be just right, and the miller adjusts it constantly, judging by the sound and the quality of the flour being produced. The flour that emerges is warm from the grinding process. It has a fresh, almost sweet smell, completely different from the grain it came from. This is whole wheat flour, nothing has been removed. The bran, the germ, the endosperm, all ground together. It's coarser than modern flour, with a texture we might find rough, but it's wholesome, nutritious, full of everything the grain has to offer. Some of the flour is collected as payment for the milling. The rest is carefully swept up and returned to you in your sack. You thank the miller, heft your sack, and make your way back home. The journey from grain to flour is complete. Now comes the transformation from flour to bread. The medieval kitchen. Let's step inside a typical medieval peasant home. It's a modest structure, probably just 1 or 2 rooms, with walls of wattle and daub-woven branches covered with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. The roof is thatched with reeds or straw. There are small windows, often unglazed or covered with oiled cloth to let in light while keeping out the worst of the weather. The center of the home, literally and figuratively, is the hearth. This is where cooking is done, where warmth is generated, where the family gathers. The fire is never allowed to go completely out if it can be helped, for starting a fire is a time-consuming process involving flint and steel and considerable patience. Instead, the fire is banked at night, buried in ashes to slow its burning, and coaxed back to life in the morning. The kitchen area is simple. There are a few wooden bowls and platters, perhaps some pottery vessels for storage. There are wooden spoons and knives, a large pot or cauldron that can be hung over the fire, and there's a kneading trough, a large wooden bowl or trough specifically used for mixing and kneading dough. Let's imagine it's early in the morning, shortly after dawn. The fire has been revived and is crackling cheerfully. The first light of day is filtering through the window. It's time to make bread. The first step is to prepare the leaven. Now, in medieval times, they didn't have commercial yeast the way we do today. Instead, they relied on natural fermentation, on wild yeasts that lived in the air and in the flour itself. Many households maintained a starter, a portion of dough saved from the previous baking, kept moist and alive, fed with small amounts of flour and water. This starter contains the wild yeasts and bacteria that will leaven the new bread. If you've ever maintained a sourdough starter, you understand this process. It's the same principle, the same ancient technique. Our bread maker, let's say she's a woman named Agnes. Though of course, men-made bread too, reaches into a covered pot and pulls out a piece of the old dough. It's soft, slightly sticky, and has a pleasantly sour smell, the smell of fermentation, of life and activity at a microscopic level we can't see but can certainly detect. She places the starter into the kneading trough and adds some warm water. Not hot water would kill the yeasts, but pleasantly warm, about the temperature of fresh milk. She breaks up the starter with her hands, mixing it with the water till it dissolves into a cloudy, slightly bubbly liquid. Now, she begins adding flour. She doesn't measure it precisely. There are no measuring cups, no scales. Instead, she judges by experience, by the look and feel of the dough. She adds flour gradually, mixing it in with her hands, feeling the texture change as the liquid becomes a shaggy dough. When enough flour has been added, she sprinkles some more on the surface of her work area, perhaps the top of a table or a board laid across her lap, and turns out the dough. And now comes the kneading, the rhythm of kneading. Kneading is one of those activities that seem simple, but is actually quite profound. The motion is straightforward. You press the dough away from you with the heels of your hands, then fold it back over itself. Give it a slight turn, and press again. Press, fold, turn, press, fold, turn. But within the simple motion lies something almost meditative. Your hands develop a rhythm. Your breathing synchronizes with the movement. Time becomes fluid, measured not by minutes, but by the changing texture of the dough beneath your hands. Agnes kneads steadily, not rushing. She's done this thousands of times before, and she'll do it thousands of times again. The dough is cool and rough at first, bumpy with uneven pockets of flour and water, but gradually, as she continues to knead, it transforms. The gluten in the flour begins to develop, forming long, elastic strands. These strands create a network throughout the dough, giving it structure, allowing it to trap the gases that the yeast will produce. The dough becomes smoother and more cohesive. It starts to feel alive beneath your hands, elastic and responsive. Agnes adds a pinch of salt, precious salt, carefully hoarded and used sparingly. Salt not only flavors the bread, but also helps control the fermentation and strengthen the gluten. She kneads it in thoroughly, feeling the dough become even smoother, even more elastic. The kneading continues for quite some time. There's no clock to watch, no timer to set. Agnes simply knows, through experience, when the dough is ready. She knows by the feel of it, by the way it responds to her hands. When pressed, it should spring back slowly but surely. It should be smooth and satiny on the surface. It should feel alive. Finally, she gathers the dough into a ball, rotating it against the work surface with her hands to create tension on the surface, shaping it into a smooth, round form. She places it back in the kneading trough, covers it with a damp cloth to prevent it from drying out, and sets it aside in a warm place near the hearth. Now comes the waiting. The dough needs to rise, to ferment, to double in size. In a warm kitchen, this might take 2 or 3 hours. In a cooler environment, it might take longer. Agnes is patient. She has other tasks to attend to, perhaps some mending, or preparing other food, or tending to children or animals. She checks the dough periodically, but mostly she simply lets it do its work. This rising period is crucial. The yeasts in the dough consume the sugars in the flour and produce carbon dioxide gas. This gas gets trapped in the gluten network, forming tiny bubbles throughout the dough, making it expand and become light and airy. At the same time, the bacteria in the starter are producing acids that give sourdough its characteristic tangy flavor. If we could watch the dough in time lapse, we would see it slowly swelling, like something breathing, like something alive. Because it is alive, in a sense teeming with microscopic organisms, all working together to transform flour and water into something greater than the sum of its parts. Shaping and final rise after several hours. Agnes checks the dough. It has risen beautifully, nearly doubling in size. The surface is domed and smooth. When she presses a finger into it gently, the indentation remains a sign that the dough is properly fermented and ready for the next stage. She uncovers the trough and turns the dough out onto her work surface again. Some of the gas escapes with a soft sigh. You can hear it, feel it. The dough deflates somewhat, but that's expected and normal. Now, she divides the dough. A single large batch might be divided into several smaller loaves, perhaps 4 or 5, depending on the size. She uses a knife to cut the dough, and she's practiced enough that the portions are roughly equal without any need for weighing. Each portion is shaped. This is done carefully, with attention and intention. She cups her hands around each piece of dough and rotates it against the work surface, creating tension on the surface once again. This tension is important. It helps the loaf hold its shape and rise upward rather than spreading outward. The shaped loaves are placed on a board or directly on the hearth if it has been properly cleaned and prepared. They're set a little distance apart as they'll expand during their final rise. Then they're covered again with that damp cloth. And once more, Agnes waits. This second rise is shorter than the first, perhaps an hour or so. The yeast is active now, well established, and the dough rises more quickly. As she waits, Agnes prepares the oven. The communal oven now. In many medieval villages, there was a communal oven. Like the mill, this was often owned by the lord and operated under his authority. Villagers would bring their shaped loaves to this oven to be baked, paying a small fee for the service. The communal oven is a large structure, built of stone or brick, with a domed interior. It's heated by burning wood directly inside it. The fire is lit hours before the baking is to begin, and wood is continuously fed into it until the oven reaches the right temperature. How do you know when a medieval oven is hot enough? There's no thermometer, no dial to check. Instead, the baker, the person who tends the communal oven, judges by experience and by several time-tested methods. The stones of the oven interior will glow white hot when it's ready. A handful of flour tossed inside should brown quickly, but not burn immediately. Some bakers even use a white feather if it browns when held inside the oven. The temperature is right. When the oven is hot enough, the fire is raked out. The coals and ashes are pulled to the side or removed entirely, and the floor of the oven is quickly swept clean with a wet broom made of twigs or straw. The moisture on the broom creates a brief hiss of steam as it touches the hot stones, helping to clean away any ash. Now, the oven is ready, and the villagers begin arriving with their loaves. Agnes joins the queue, her board balanced carefully with its burden of risen dough. The loaves have puffed up beautifully during their second rise. They're soft and delicate now, and must be handled gently so as not to deflate them. Each baker has marked their loaves in some way, perhaps with a slash from a knife, or a pattern pressed into the top with a fingertip, or even a special stamp that indicates which household the bread comes from. This way, when the baking is done, everyone can identify and retrieve their own bread. The baker uses a long-handled wooden paddle called a peel to load the loaves into the oven. He slides the peel under each loaf, lifts it carefully, and places it inside the oven, directly on the hot stone floor. The loaves are arranged with care, positioned to allow heat to circulate around them. When the oven is full, the door, a heavy wooden or metal affair, is closed and sealed. Sometimes clay or mud is pressed around the edges to keep the heat in. And now again, there is waiting. The transformation. Inside the sealed oven, magic is happening. Well, not magic chemistry and physics, but it might as well be magic for all that medieval people understood the science of it. They only knew that flour and water and leaven, subjected to intense heat, became bread. In the first few minutes, the heat causes the yeasts to become extremely active. They produce a final burst of carbon dioxide, and the loaves expand rapidly, a phenomenon bakers call oven spring. The loaves puff up, rising higher than they were even before they went into the oven. The heat sets the structure of the gluten network, transforming the soft dough into something with enough structure to hold its shape. The starches in the flour gelatinize, becoming digestible. The surface of the loaves begins to brown, undergoing a complex series of chemical reactions called the Maillard reaction, which creates hundreds of flavor compounds and gives bread its characteristic golden brown crust. The smell that begins to emerge from the oven is, well, is there any smell more universally beloved than baking bread? It's warm and yeasty and slightly sweet, and somehow deeply comforting. It's a smell that speaks of home, of nourishment, of care and competence. The villagers waiting outside the oven can smell it too, and despite having lived with this smell all their lives, it still makes mouths water, still creates anticipation. The baking takes time, perhaps an hour for these moderately sized loaves. The baker checks periodically, opening the door just a crack to peek inside, judging the color of the crusts, the firmness of the loaves. When they're done, the crust will be a deep golden brown, almost mahogany in places. The loaves will sound hollow when tapped on the bottom, a sign that the interior has fully cooked and steam has driven moisture from the crumb. Finally, the baker judges them done. The door is opened, and heat rolls out in a wave. Using the peel, he carefully removes each loaf, checking the marks to identify whose is whose, setting them on a wooden table to cool. The bread is beautiful. The crusts are deeply colored and glossy, with splits and cracks where steam has escaped, creating rustic patterns. The loaves are firm to the touch but not hard, and they make a hollow, satisfying sound when tapped. Agnes collects her loaves, handling them carefully, they're still very hot, and wraps them in the cloth she brought. She makes her way back home through the village, the warm bundles of bread pressed against her body, their heat and smell a constant, pleasant companion. Breaking bread back at home, Agnes sets the loaves on the table to finish cooling. It's tempting to cut into them immediately, but bread is actually better if you let it cool completely first. The interior continues to set as it cools, and cutting too early can result in a gummy texture. But this is a lesson patience can sometimes struggle with. The smell is intoxicating, the warmth is inviting, and there's something primal about fresh bread, something that speaks to our deepest needs and desires. Eventually, and really, it doesn't take that long, perhaps half an hour, the bread has cooled enough. Agnes takes one loaf and places it on the table. She takes her knife, a simple but effective tool, its blade worn from years of sharpening, and begins to cut. The knife saws through the crust with a satisfying crunch. The interior of the loaf is revealed, the crumb, bakers call it. It's a warm, off-white color, with an uneven texture full of holes of various sizes. This is the signature of naturally leavened bread, this irregular, organic-looking crumb. It's nothing like the uniform texture of modern, commercially yeasted bread. It's wilder, more variable, more alive. Steam rises from the cut surface, the bread is still warm inside. Agnes cuts thick slices. Medieval bread was substantial, meant to be filling, meant to be the foundation of a meal. A slice might be an inch thick or more. She takes a piece and bites into it. The crust crunches between her teeth, giving way to the softer interior. The flavor is complex, slightly sour from the natural fermentation, nutty from the whole wheat, with a depth and character that comes from slow fermentation and simple ingredients. This bread is deeply satisfying. It has weight and substance. It fills the belly and nourishes the body. For medieval people, bread like this was life itself. It was the staff of life, they called it, the foundation on which everything else rested. A meal might be a thick slice of this bread topped with cheese, or dipped in pottage, a thick vegetable stew, or simply bread and ale, the two fundamental elements of the medieval diet. The bread could be a few days old, it keeps quite well, and would be softened by dipping in the ale or stew. Nothing was wasted. Bread that had gone truly hard might be used to make trenchers, thick slices that served as edible plates, soaking up the juices from meat or stew. At the end of the meal, the juice-soaked trencher might be eaten, or given to the poor, or fed to animals. Variations and seasons. The bread we have made today, the simple whole wheat sourdough, was the standard for most peasants most of the time. But there were variations, depending on season, region, and prosperity. In spring, when last year's grain was running low, but the new harvest was still months away, bread might include whatever else was available: dried peas or beans ground into the flour, for instance, stretching the precious wheat a little further. In regions where wheat grew poorly, other grains predominated. Rye was common in northern Europe, producing a darker, denser bread with a more robust flavor. Barley bread was even heavier, less refined, but still nourishing and filling. The wealthy, of course, had access to more refined bread. Their flour might be sifted to remove the bran, producing a lighter, whiter loaf. They might have bread made with additions: honey for sweetness, eggs for richness, butter or milk for tenderness. These enriched breads were treats, luxuries, far beyond what the average peasant could afford for daily eating. There were also special breads for special occasions. Feast days might bring sweet breads, perhaps with dried fruits or spices. The 12th night cake, the hot cross, buns of Easter, the harvest loaves decoratively shaped, these punctuated the year, marking the turning of seasons and the rhythm of religious observance. But for most people, most days, it was simple bread like what Agnes made. And there's something beautiful in that simplicity, something honest and true. The bread requires only the most basic ingredients: grain, water, salt, and time. Yet, from these simple elements comes something that has nourished humanity for thousands of years. The daily rhythm. Let's think about bread not just as a product, but as part of the rhythm of daily life. The making of bread structures time, creates a cadence to the day, the week, the year. Baking day comes around regularly, perhaps every 3 or 4 days for a typical household. The bread must be made, and so time is organized around this necessity. Other tasks are scheduled around the baking. The fire must be tended. The dough must be mixed and kneaded when there's time and energy for it, often early in the morning, before the heat of the day, before other tasks become pressing. There's a seasonal rhythm too. After harvest, grain is plentiful and bread making perhaps feels a little easier, less anxious. The granaries and storage chests are full. There's a sense of security, of provision. But as winter progresses and the stored grain gradually diminishes, each measure of flour becomes more precious. In late winter and early spring, before the new harvest, bread might become more of an anxiety, less of a comfort. Is there enough? Will it last? This is one reason why Lent, the period of fasting before Easter, often coincides with this lean time of year. The religious requirement to eat simply, to abstain from rich foods, aligns with the practical reality that rich foods are scarce anyway. In early spring, when the new harvest comes in, there's celebration. The first bread from the new wheat has a quality of thanksgiving, of relief, of renewal. The cycle begins again. The social dimension bread making, especially in its medieval context, was never truly a solitary activity. It was embedded in a web of social relationships and obligations. There was the relationship with the Lord, mediated through the manorial mill and oven. The requirement to use these facilities rather than grinding grain and baking at home was a source of resentment for many peasants. They paid for these services with a portion of their flour or bread, and this felt like a burden, a tax on their labor. Yet at the same time, the communal oven created a gathering place, a point of social contact. Women especially would meet there, waiting for their bread to bake. And this became an opportunity for conversation, for the exchange of news and gossip, for the maintenance of social bonds. The sharing of bread carried deep significance. To break bread together was to create or acknowledge a bond. The word companion comes from Latin roots meaning with bread, one with whom you share bread. This sharing was ritualized in religious contexts, the Eucharist being the paramount example, but it extended into everyday life as well. To give someone bread was an act of charity, of care. The obligation to give alms to the poor often took the form of bread. Monasteries and churches distributed bread to those in need. The sharing of bread was a fundamental social glue, binding community together. The spiritual dimension. It's impossible to think about bread in the medieval context without considering its spiritual significance. Bread was central to Christian worship and theology. The Lord's Prayer asks for daily bread, acknowledging bread as the symbol and substance of basic human need. Jesus called himself the bread of life in the Gospel of John. The Eucharist, the central sacrament of Christian worship, transforms bread into the body of Christ. This theological importance elevated bread beyond mere food. It became sacred, symbolic, laden with meaning. The making of bread could be seen as a spiritual act, a participation in divine provision. Many women, as they kneaded their dough, would pray simple prayers, often asking for blessing on the bread, for protection of the household, for health and provision. The sign of the cross might be traced over the dough before it was set to rise, a blessing and a protection against evil. When the bread was cut, it might be cut crosswise first, again making the sign of the cross. The first slice might be given to a beggar, if one appeared, as an act of charity and faith. There were folk beliefs too, predating Christianity, woven into the practice of bread making. Bread was thought to have protective qualities. A loaf might be baked into the thatch of a new house for blessing and protection. Bread baked on certain holy days was thought to have special properties. These beliefs might seem superstitious to us now, but they speak to the profound importance of bread, the way it was intertwined with every aspect of life: physical, social, spiritual, skill and knowledge. We should pause to appreciate the skill involved in medieval bread making. Without thermometers or timers or reliable measuring tools, the bread maker relied entirely on experience and observation. She had to judge the temperature of water by feel warm enough to activate the yeast, but not so hot as to kill it. She had to know by the look and feel of the dough whether it had been kneaded enough. She had to judge the timing of rises by observation, by pressing the dough and feeling its response. She had to understand the variations caused by different flours, different temperatures, different seasons. Flour from new wheat behaves differently than flour from grain that's been stored for months. Dough rises faster in summer than in winter. Humid weather affects the flour and the dough differently than dry weather. All of this knowledge was accumulated through experience, through making bread again and again and again, through learning from mothers and grandmothers, through years of practice. It was knowledge held in the hands and the eyes and the intuition, not written down in recipes or codified in measurements. This is one reason why medieval bread making seems so mysterious to us now. We're accustomed to precise recipes, to measurements in cups and grams, to temperatures in degrees. But medieval bakers worked with none of these things. They worked with understanding, with feel, with practiced skill, and yet they produced beautiful bread, nourishing bread, bread that sustained entire civilizations for centuries. There's a lesson in that, perhaps. A reminder that not everything needs to be precisely controlled and measured. Sometimes, the hands know what to do. Sometimes, experience and intuition are enough. The grain itself. Let's turn our attention back to the grain itself for a moment, to the wheat or rye or barley that becomes flour, that becomes bread. Medieval grains were different from modern ones. They were older varieties, less modified, less specialized. Wheat varied more from region to region, adapted to local conditions over many generations. These older varieties of wheat were often taller than modern wheat, with longer stalks. They were less uniform in their characteristics. The grains themselves were smaller, harder, more variable in size and shape. But in many ways, these older wheats were more robust. They could tolerate poorer soils, more variable weather conditions. They didn't require the intense fertilization and pest control that modern wheat depends on. They were survivors, adapted to a harsher world. The flour from these wheats had different properties too. The gluten structure was often weaker, making the dough less elastic than modern bread dough. The bread was denser, heavier, less likely to achieve a light, airy crumb. But it was deeply nutritious. Nothing was removed from the grain, the bran, the germ, all of it was ground together. This meant the bread was high in fiber, in vitamins, in minerals. It was whole food, in the truest sense. Modern white bread, for all its lightness and uniform texture, is nutritionally impoverished compared to medieval whole grain bread. We've gained something in texture and convenience, but we've lost something too. The miller's craft. Let's return to the mill for a moment and think more deeply about the miller's work. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves more attention. The miller's day begins early, often before dawn. He must check the water levels if it's a watermill, or assess the wind if it's a windmill. The forces of nature power his mill, and he must work with them, accommodate them. If water levels are low, the mill works more slowly. If they're too high, flooding might be a concern. If there's no wind, a windmill stands idle. If there's too much wind, the sails must be furled to prevent damage. The miller must understand his machinery intimately. The great wheel, the gears and cogs and drive shafts, the millstones themselves, all of these components must be maintained, repaired, adjusted. The millstones in particular require skilled attention. They don't remain perfectly smooth and flat. They develop grooves and wear patterns. Periodically, they must be dressed, a process of carefully chipping and carving the stone surface to restore the proper pattern of grooves that channel the grain between the stones. This dressing is done with special hammers and chisels. It's precise work, demanding skill and patience. The pattern must be just right to ensure the grain is ground evenly and efficiently. The miller also has to guard against fire, a constant danger. The friction of the stones generates heat. If something goes wrong, if a stone is set too tight, if grain flow is interrupted, if wooden parts rub together, sparks can be created. And in an environment filled with fine, combustible flour dust, a spark can lead to disaster. Mills burned with tragic regularity in medieval times. The miller had to be always vigilant, always aware, always listening and watching for signs of trouble. Despite these dangers and the demanding nature of the work, the miller occupied an important position in the community. He possessed specialized knowledge and controlled a vital resource. He was prosperous by peasant standards, his payment in flour adding up to a comfortable living. But he was also often resented. The requirement to use the manorial mill, the fees he charged, the perception that he might cheat customers by taking more than is due, all of this made the miller a figure of suspicion in popular culture. Medieval stories and jokes often portrayed millers as dishonest. Whether this reputation was deserved is hard to say. Certainly some millers were honest and fair, others, perhaps, less so. But the position itself as a middleman between peasant labor and daily bread made the miller a natural target for resentment in a world where margins were thin and fairness in dealings was a matter of survival, preservation, and storage. Once bread is baked, it must be stored properly if it's to last. And making bread last was important. You didn't want to bake every single day if you could avoid it. Fresh bread is soft and moist, but it begins to stale almost immediately. The moisture in the crumb migrates to the crust, making the crust softer and the interior drier and firmer. This is the process of staling, and it's inevitable. Medieval people stored bread in various ways, depending on what they had available. A bread box or bread cupboard, a wooden cabinet with ventilation holes, helped protect bread from pests while allowing air circulation. Some bread was deliberately dried into hard tack or biscuit. This bread was baked twice. The word biscuit literally means twice cooked, driving out much of the moisture and creating a product that could last for weeks or months. This was especially important for travelers, soldiers, and sailors, anyone who needed portable food that wouldn't spoil. Hard tack wasn't particularly pleasant to eat. It was rock hard and often needed to be soaked in liquid before it could be consumed, but it was reliable, and reliability was worth more than pleasure when it came to food security. Even everyday bread that had gone stale had its uses. It could be torn into pieces and added to soups and stews, where it would soften and help thicken the dish. It could be soaked in milk or ale and eaten as a kind of porridge. It could be dried completely and ground into breadcrumbs for various uses. Nothing was wasted. This is a theme that runs through all of medieval life, but perhaps especially in relation to food. When food is scarce, when its production requires such tremendous labor, waste is not merely inefficient, it's almost sinful. Regional variations. While we've been focusing on a fairly generic medieval wheat bread, it's worth acknowledging that bread varied enormously across medieval Europe. In the far north, in Scandinavia and northern Germany, rye was the dominant grain. Rye bread is denser and darker than wheat bread, with a distinctive sour flavor. It's hearty and filling, well suited to cold climates and hard work. In Scotland and Ireland, oats were common. Oat bread, really more of an oat cake, was made from oat flour mixed with water and cooked on a griddle rather than baked in an oven. These flat oat cakes were a staple food, carried by travelers and workers for quick sustenance. In southern Europe, especially around the Mediterranean, wheat was more common, and the bread could be lighter, closer to what we might think of as Italian or French bread today. In some regions, bread was flavored with olive oil, giving it a different character entirely. In Eastern Europe, bread might include buckwheat or other grains, and often had distinctive shapes and decorative patterns with religious or cultural significance. Even within a single country, bread varied from region to region, village to village. Local traditions, local grains, local ovens, all of these created variety. And then there was the class dimension. The bread of nobles was different from the bread of merchants, which was different from the bread of peasants. White bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour, was a luxury item, mark of status. Brown bread, made from whole grain flour, was common fare. The darkest, coarsest bread, made from whatever grains and additions were available, was poverty food. The saying, upper crust, comes from this distinction. The top crust of a loaf, the part that browns most beautifully in the oven, was considered the best part, and might be reserved for the master of the house or honored guests. The lower crust, in contact with the oven floor, might be burnt or soiled, and was therefore less desirable. The rhythm of the day. Let's step back and think about bread making as part of the rhythm of a medieval day. We've walked through the process, but let's feel it now as a lived experience. You wake before dawn. The house is dark and cold. The first task is to revive the fire, coaxing embers back to flame, adding wood carefully until there's enough heat to drive back the chill. While the fire builds, you might step outside. The world is quiet at this hour, the sky just beginning to lighten in the east. There's a quality to pre-dawn air, isn't there? Cool and still, full of possibility. Back inside, you prepare to make bread. You fetch the water, perhaps from a well in the yard, perhaps from a barrel filled the night before. The water is cold, so you set some in a pot near the fire to warm while you prepare other things. You uncover the sourdough starter, smelling its sharp, yeasty tang. You have this routine down so well that your hands move almost without thought. Starter into the bowl. Warm water. You test it with your fingertip, judging the temperature. Mix, then flour, then more flour, watching the dough come together. Turn it out, begin to knead. By now, the household is stirring. Children wake, stumble sleepily to the fire. Perhaps your husband tends to animals or begins some other task. Life starts up around you, but your hands continue their rhythmic work. Press, fold, turn, press, fold, turn. The dough goes to rise. You move on to other tasks, preparing a simple breakfast of porridge or bread from yesterday's baking. Sweeping, mending, tending the fire, preparing other food for the day's meals. Periodically, you check the dough. Not ready yet. Later, you check again. Still not quite. Then, finally, yes, it's ready. The dough has risen beautifully, and it's time for the next stage. Shape the loaves. Cover them. Let them rise again. While you continue with your day, perhaps you do some spinning or weaving. Perhaps you tend a garden. Perhaps you care for children or help with farm work. Time for the bread to go to the oven. You gather up your board with its burden of risen loaves and make your way through the village to the communal oven. Other women are there, or arriving at the same time. You greet each other, exchange a few words of news or complaint or humor. The baker loads the loaves. The door closes. You wait, or you go home and return later. Either way, there's this pause, this interlude where the work is out of your hands, where heat and time do their work. When the bread is ready, you collect it, feel its warmth, smell its incomparable smell. You carry it home carefully, treasuring it. And then, finally, there's the moment of cutting into it, of eating, of being nourished by the work of your hands and the grain of the earth, and the warmth of fire. This is how life was lived, day by day, task by task, in rhythm with necessity and season. Failures and successes. Not every loaf turned out perfectly. It's worth acknowledging that bread making, especially without modern tools and precise control, was subject to many variables, and sometimes things went wrong. Sometimes the dough didn't rise properly. Perhaps the starter wasn't active enough, or the temperature was too cold. The resulting bread would be dense, heavy, more like hardtack than proper bread. Sometimes the dough rose too much, over-fermenting, becoming sour and loose and hard to handle. The bread might collapse in the oven, or have an unpleasantly strong sour flavor. Sometimes the oven temperature was wrong, too hot, and the crust would burn before the interior cooked. Too cool, and the bread would be pale and lack proper structure. Sometimes problems with the grain or flour itself caused issues. Grain that had gotten damp and begun to sprout before milling produced flour that made sticky, difficult dough. Grain contaminated with ergot, a fungus that could cause serious illness, had to be carefully screened out. These failures could be serious. Wasting flour, wasting time, wasting fuel, all of these represented real losses for people living on the edge of subsistence. But experienced bread makers minimized these failures. They knew their start, knew their ovens, knew their flour. They could tell by subtle signs whether things were going right or wrong, and could adjust accordingly. And when the bread did turn out well, as it usually did in practiced hands, there was a quiet satisfaction in that. Not pride, exactly, though perhaps a bit of that too, but more a sense of competence, of having done something necessary and done it well. This bread would feed your family. It would keep them healthy and strong. It was the product of your skill and care. That mattered. That meant something. The broader economy. Let's zoom out a bit and think about bread in the larger economic context of medieval society. Grain was the foundation of the medieval economy. Land was valued primarily by how much grain it could produce. Rents were often paid in grain. Taxes were calculated based on grain production. Wars were won or lost based on the ability to supply armies with grain for bread. The price of bread was a matter of intense concern to both rulers and commoners. When grain was plentiful, bread was affordable, and social stability was more easily maintained. When grain was scarce due to poor harvests, war, or other disruptions, bread prices soared, and unrest often followed. Medieval governments tried to regulate bread prices through various means. There were laws about how much bread should weigh, how much it should cost, what quality flour should be used for different grades of bread. Bakers who cheated on weight or quality could face serious penalties. There is a famous medieval punishment for dishonest bakers being dragged through the streets on a sledge with the offending loaf hung around their neck. Whether this was actually commonly done or was more of a threat is unclear, but it speaks to how seriously bread fraud was taken. The baking trade, in towns and cities where there were professional bakers, was carefully regulated by guilds. These guilds controlled who could become a baker, what standards they had to maintain, what they could charge. This regulation was meant to protect consumers, but it also protected established bakers from competition. For peasants making their own bread, these regulations mattered less directly, but they were still affected by the broader grain economy. The prices they could get for their surplus grain, the rents they owed to lords, the tithes they owed to the church, all of these were calculated in grain or influenced by grain prices. Bread in memory and metaphor. Bread has lived in human consciousness, not just as food but as symbol and metaphor for thousands of years, and this was certainly true in the medieval world. We've already touched on the religious significance. Bread as the body of Christ, bread as daily sustenance prayed for, but the metaphorical uses extended further. To earn one's bread meant to work for one's living. A breadwinner was one who supported a household. The bread and butter issues were the fundamental concerns, the basics of survival. Breaking bread together, as we've noted, signified companionship, fellowship, community. To share bread was to acknowledge a bond. To refuse to break bread with someone was a serious social statement. Bread appears in medieval literature and folklore constantly. It's in fairy tales the breadcrumbs Hansel and Gretel drop to find their way home. It's in legends and romances. It's in the records of real events, where the availability or lack of bread shapes the course of history. People remembered particular breads: the bread they ate at feasts, the bread they made with their mother as a child, the bread they shared with friends. Bread carried memory, carried meaning beyond its role as mere nutrition. The sensory experience. Let's take a moment to really sink into the sensory experience of medieval bread making. We've described the process, but let's feel it now. The texture of flour between your fingers, soft, slightly cool, with a distinctive feel that's hard to describe but instantly recognizable. When you press flour between thumb and forefinger, it has a slight grittiness, a texture that compresses and then falls apart. The smell of flour is mild, slightly sweet, dusty. Fresh flour has a cleaner smell than old flour, which can develop a stale, slightly rancid note over time. Water transforms the flour. The first touches of water make the flour clump and stick. More water, and it becomes a shaggy mass, rough and uneven. As you knead, it becomes smoother, more unified, until finally it feels like one coherent thing rather than flour and water combined. The smell of fermenting dough is distinctive, yeasty, slightly sour, alive. It's not unpleasant, though some people find it strange if they're not accustomed to it. It's the smell of transformation, of microscopic life doing its work. The sound of kneading is subtle, a soft, rhythmic thudding, the slight squeak of dough against wood. In a quiet kitchen, These sounds become meditative, focusing. The warmth of rising dough is gentle but noticeable. If you hold your hand near dough that's actively fermenting, you can feel the slight warmth it generates. The smell of baking bread is, as we've said, one of the most universally beloved scents. It's complex. There are notes of caramelization, of toasted grain, of yeast, all combining into something that speaks directly to our deepest responses. The sound of cutting through a crust, that satisfying crunch followed by the softer resistance of the crumb. The way a really good crust crackles slightly as it cools, the moisture inside creating tiny fractures in the surface. The taste of fresh bread. Finally, the way the flavors unfold in your mouth. First, the simple taste of grain, then the slightly sour notes from fermentation, the nuttiness from the whole wheat, the hint of salt. It's simple but complex, satisfying in a way that's hard to explain, but easy to feel. Children and bread children grew up with bread making as a constant presence in their lives. From earliest memory, they would have seen their mothers or other women making bread, would have been surrounded by the sights and smells and sounds of it. As they grew, they would have been gradually incorporated into the work. A small child might be given a bit of dough to play with. This both keeps them occupied and begins their education in how dough feels and behaves. Older children would be given real tasks, fetching water, adding flour to the bowl, eventually, kneading under supervision. By the time a girl reached her teens, she would be expected to be able to make bread competently on her own. Boys, too, learned about bread making, though they were less likely to do it as a primary task, but they might help with harvesting and threshing, might to carry grain to the mill, tend the fire for baking. They understood the process, could do it if needed. This transmission of knowledge from generation to generation was how skills were preserved. There were no cookbooks for most people. No schools where bread making was taught. There was only the example of your elders, the practice of your own hands, the accumulated wisdom passed down. Children learned not just the techniques, but the values associated with bread making. The importance of not wasting flour, the necessity of planning ahead so that bread would be ready when needed, the value of patience, of working at the pace required by the task, rather than the pace you might prefer. Feast and famine, the medieval year was not uniform. It was a rhythm of plenty and scarcity, feast and fast, abundance and want. After harvest, in autumn, there was relative plenty. Granaries were full. Bread could be made without anxiety. There might even be enough to make special breads, to celebrate, to share generously. Winter was a time of careful management. Grain had to be made to last until spring, then until the new harvest. Portions might be measured more carefully. Bread might be stretched with other ingredients or baked to be denser and more filling. Spring was often the hardest time. The stored grain from the previous harvest was running low. The new crop wouldn't be ready for months yet. This was the hungry gap, and bread might become scarce. People might go hungry. The price of bread, for those who had to buy it, might become prohibitive. When the new harvest came in, it was a relief so profound, it's hard for us, in our world of year-round abundance, to fully appreciate. The first bread from the new wheat was celebrated. It meant survival. It meant continuation. It meant that life could go on for another year. Medieval people lived much closer to the edge than we do. A few bad harvests in succession could mean famine. Bread, therefore, was never simply food, it was security, it was life itself. The taste of history. What did medieval bread actually taste like? We can make educated guesses based on recipes and descriptions, on understanding the ingredients and methods, but direct experience is, of course, impossible. We know it was denser than modern bread. The whole grain flour, the natural leavening, the baking methods all produced a more compact loaf. We know it had a more pronounced sour flavor from the natural fermentation. Sourdough bread today can give us some sense of this, though medieval bread was likely even more sour, as the long, slow fermentation was more pronounced. The texture would have been coarser, less uniform. The crumb would have had irregular holes, larger and smaller pockets of air distributed unevenly through the loaf. The flavor would have been more complex than modern white bread, the whole wheat providing nutty, slightly bitter notes, the fermentation adding depth and tang. The crust would have been thicker, harder, more substantial than what we're used to. It would have required real chewing, would have provided textural contrast to the softer interior. Was it delicious? By our standards, perhaps not always, but by medieval standards, fresh bread was a delight, a comfort, a pleasure. It satisfied not just hunger, but deeper needs for security, for home, for connection to place and family and tradition. Bread and identity. The bread you ate said something about who you were. Your social class, your region, your prosperity, all could be read in the bread on your table. White bread was prestigious. To have bread made from finely sifted flour marked you as someone of means. Noble households served white bread to family and honored guests, darker bread to servants and lesser folk. But even within the peasant class, there were distinctions. A prosperous peasant might have bread of reasonable quality, made from pure wheat or rye. A struggling peasant might have bread mixed with peas or beans or even acorns in times of desperation. The shape and marking of bread could indicate regional identity. Different areas had different traditional shapes, different patterns marked on the surface. You could sometimes tell where someone came from by the bread they made. For travelers, the bread of home became a powerful symbol of identity and belonging. Soldiers, merchants, pilgrims all carried memories of the particular taste and texture of the bread from their homeland, and returning home meant returning to that familiar bread. Bread was comfort, was memory, was identity made edible. The sanctity of bread. We've touched on the religious significance of bread, but it's worth dwelling on this a bit more. In medieval Christianity, bread was not merely symbolic of spiritual things, it was itself spiritual. The doctrine of transubstantiation held that the communion bread literally became the body of Christ. This was not metaphor or symbol, it was held to be actual, physical transformation, even though the bread still looked and tasted like bread. This gave bread a special status. All bread, not just communion bread, was treated with respect. Dropping bread on the floor was a minor tragedy. You would pick it up, dust it off, perhaps kiss it before eating it, as an act of reverence. The sign of the cross made over bread before cutting, it was not just habit or superstition, it was an acknowledgement of bread's sacred character, a blessing, a prayer. Some people believed that bread baked on certain holy days had special properties. Good Friday bread, for instance, was thought to never mold, to have healing properties, to protect against evil. Whether these beliefs had any basis in fact is beside the point. The point is that bread existed in a spiritual dimension as well as a physical one. It was holy, or could be. It connected the mundane work of daily life with the eternal truths of faith. The evolution of bread. Looking back from our perspective, we can see that medieval bread making was part of a long evolutionary arc of human grain use. Thousands of years earlier, our ancestors had first discovered that grass seeds, the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, could be gathered and eaten. Later, they learned that these seeds could be planted, that their growth could be encouraged, that different varieties could be selected and developed. The discovery of leavening probably accidental, when some flour-water mixture was left out and wild yeast began to ferment, it transformed flat cakes into risen bread. This happened thousands of years before the medieval period we've been exploring. By medieval times, bread making was already an ancient art, refined through countless generations, but it was still recognizable as part of the same tradition, the same basic process of transforming grain into nourishment. After the medieval period, bread making would continue to evolve. The development of commercial yeast in the 19th century would make leavening more reliable and predictable. Industrial milling would produce more refined flours. Modern baking equipment would make the process faster and more controlled. We've gained much through these developments: consistency, convenience, efficiency. But we've lost something too: the intimate connection with the process, the understanding born of hands-on experience, the patience required by slower methods. Closing reflections. We've spent a long time now walking through the process of making bread in the medieval world. From field to flour to dough to loaf, we've followed the entire journey, taking our time, letting each stage unfold at its own pace. What can we take from this exploration? What does it offer us, here in our very different world? Perhaps it's a reminder of the value of patience, of working at the pace required by the task, rather than the pace we might wish for. Bread cannot be rushed, it rises when it's ready, bakes in its own time. There's wisdom in that. Perhaps it's an appreciation for the skill and knowledge embedded in everyday tasks. Making bread seems simple, but doing it well requires understanding, experience, attention. Medieval people possessed deep competence in their crafts, even when those crafts seem humble to us. Perhaps it's a sense of connection to the past, to the long chain of human experience, to the fundamental things that sustain life. We still eat bread, though our bread is different. We still depend on grain, though we're separated from its production. The basic needs haven't changed, even though everything else has. Or perhaps it's simply the pleasure of imagining a different way of life, a different rhythm of days. There's something soothing about contemplating these slow, careful processes. In our fast-paced world, there's value in occasionally dwelling on the slow, the patient, the methodical. The making of bread in the medieval world was hard work, necessary work, endless work. But it was also craft and community and care. It was one of the threads that bound society together, that connected people to the land and to each other. And it produced something fundamentally good, nourishing food, the staff of life, the daily bread for which people prayed and worked and hoped. Let that be our final image. A loaf of bread, fresh from the oven, golden crusted and warm. Simple, honest, essential. Made by practiced hands. Made with care. Made to nourish and sustain. The gentle art of bread making, connecting us across the centuries to those who came before.